Previously on Nine Goblins. Kung kung.
Don't forget the content warnings as well.
Yes, of course. Content warnings for horror, themes, violence, and gross food. Nasilka's intrepid band of, well,
Gobos.
I say soldiers. The goblins that follow Nasilka into battle, because like all smart men, they have figured out that, you know, she knows what she's doing and she might not get them killed. Fought a wizard.
Because she didn't step back fast enough.
Yes. Fought a wizard. Wizards in this universe are terrifying.
And not all there.
And they break reality. The wizard, when he sees, 18 or so, not small goblins, pounding towards him, panics and yanks himself away and takes the goblins with him. So they land about 50, 60 miles away from the war. They opt not to kill the wizard because they're, nice. And then they said...
They don't commit a murder.
They don't do murder.
That's correct.
Yes.
They're soldiers, not murderers.
And then they decide to try and work out how the hell they're going to get home. Meanwhile, Henry Cavill, because let's face it, kids, Sings to Trees is Henry Cavill. Has tended to a, frankly, and I don't use this word lightly, fucking terrifying bone stag. And is aware that there's something off in the woods. Perhaps 9 off things. Chapter 10. The next day was easier. The Wine and Niners had finally gotten their heads around the fact that they were here, in the woods, and not on the battlefield. Goblins are nothing if not adaptable. Fewer bushes were engaged in combat, everyone had learned to recognize poison oak, and Thumper had remembered how to spot a few kinds of edible berry. Most of them weren't ripe yet, so breakfast was a painfully sour affair. But hey, it beat starvation. They walked. They stopped occasionally to drink at streams and soak their hot, sore feet, but never for terribly long. Nasilka kept a grueling pace to start. It wasn't just a desire to keep the wizard behind her, although honestly, that was part of it. Mostly it was the tracks she'd found in the mud that morning. They looked a bit like hoof prints. Actually, they looked a lot like hoof prints, except that most hoofed animals did not have claws. She'd always thought the two were mutually exclusive, in fact, but unless they'd been stalked by a deer wearing fighting spurs, she didn't have a better explanation. She'd stamped them out, no sense causing a panic, but she didn't want to be anywhere near the owner of the tracks when they stopped tonight. Murray seemed pensive. He kept turning his head and staring into the woods, a line forming between his eyebrows and muttering something to himself. Nasilka watched him do this for the better part of an hour, until the quiet muttering started to get on her nerves. "All right, Murray, you're a genius. What do you think?" Murray grimaced. "Sorry, Sarge. Didn't ask you to be sorry. I want to know what you think." "Don't like it, Sarge." He made a grasping gesture with one hand, as if trying to pluck an answer out of the air. There's something about these woods. I can't quite place it. I'm not seeing the right thing. I'm a marsh goblin. I don't quite know what I'm looking for, but there's something that's off. Thumper's a forest goblin. Ask him. Murray started to shrug dismissively and then stopped. "Oh, maybe you're right. Hey, Thumper!" Thumper dropped back to walk next to them. "Tell me what's wrong with these woods." Thumper's brow furrowed deep enough to plant corn. "Wrong? There's nothing wrong. Perfectly good woods." He reached out and patted the bark of a passing tree. "Look at the size of this fellow. Probably half rotted out. Ants' nests, wasps too, I bet. Come down in the next big storm and kill us all. Wonderful old tree." Murray shook his head, making the grasping gesture again. No, come on. Oh, crud. Thumper, what kind of trees are these? I don't know. Oak, mostly. Good oaks, not those wretched little pin ones. Some big pines, but not many. Saw some cedar a while back. Wrong question, muttered Murray, plucking at the air again. What's the right question? Asked Nasilka. Murray made a quick silencing motion. That was a little rude to use on a superior officer, but Nasilka wasn't going to interfere with genius at work. I'm not seeing something because it isn't there. Thumper, how old is that tree? Thumper shrugged. Couple of 100 years. I'd have to cut it down and count rings to safer. Murray's hand shot out and grabbed the air as if he caught a rope. Cut it down! That's it! They aren't cutting it down! Thumper, how long since this area was logged? Logged? Thumper shook his head. This is peak forest. This is, you know, the old stuff. This hasn't been logged in the last 1,000 years. Yes, that's it. That's what's wrong. You'd rather somebody cut it all down? Asked Thumper stiffly. Fine. I mean, it's what I would expect from a marsh goblin. No. That's not. That's just it. Murray was practically dancing. Sarge, they haven't cut any trees. There is a human town right over there, practically, and they haven't cut any trees. That's a little weird, admitted Nasilka. Even we cut trees. Exactly. They need wood for houses and fences and wagons and firewood and stuff. But Sarge, they haven't touched this forest at all. Why not? Maybe they think it's haunted? Asked Nasilka, thinking of the clawed hoofprints and the whooshing. Murray shook his head. I doubt it. No one is the only source of wood for miles. No, there's only one reason people don't cut down a forest. Somebody already owns it. And who lives in forests? Nasilka felt a cold prickling crawl down her spine. You mean, Murray nodded, elves. They kept walking. There is only so long that you can clutch your weapons and wait for the white-faced figures to leap from behind the trees. For the Wine and Niners, this was about 45 minutes. Maybe there were elves. If there were, they'd probably find out soon enough. In the meantime, poison oak was a more immediate concern, and harder to spot. Nasilka called a halt in the late afternoon. All right, everybody take 5. She looked around the Wine and Niners and sighed. Most of them were doing okay, but the 2 recruits and Blanchette were about done in. The recruits were just not used to sustained marching, but poor Blanchette was grey-faced and sweating from having to cover the irregular terrain on his crutch. Blanchette, sit down before you fall down. Yeah, that goes for the bear too. Mishkin, Mushkin, sit. Murray, you still want to try raiding the farmhouse? Murray nodded. All right, Murray, you're in charge. Algol, Goober, go with Murray. Don't take any unnecessary risks. I would rather nobody saw you at all. Stealth is more important than clean clothes. Remember that. She racked her brain for anything else useful to say. Goober, get your finger out of there. They waited. And good luck. The 3 saluted and moved off towards the fields. Weasel, you and Thumper go see if you can't find something to eat. And keep your eyes peeled for anything that might make a good campsite. The rest of us will wait here. The pair saluted. Nasilka watched them go, the tiny little weasel and the slab of angry muscle that was Thumper. All right, troops, she said, turning back to Blanchette and the twins. You 3 rest up. That's an order. Blanchette, will the bear mind if I borrow your helmet? There was a brief consultation. He says it's okay, Sarge. Good, I could really use some tea. Making tea in a used orc helmet recently converted to teddy bear sedan chair was an experience, but good sergeants learn to improvise. The hard part, getting the helmet clean. Who knew that Blanchette was using so much hair gel under the thing? She had just gotten the water boiling when she heard a rustling in the bushes. It was Murray. He and Algol and Goober emerged from the woods looking thoughtful. Well, Murray and Algol looked thoughtful. Gluber had his finger up his nose again. "That was quick," she said. Murray tugged at his ponytail. "Sarge, I think you better come look at this." "What is it?" "There's nobody there." She raised her eyebrows. "That's good, right?" "They stepped out. We can grab the laundry. Nobody was the wiser." "No, Sarge, I don't think they stepped out. I think..." He fell silent. Algol put a hand on her arm. "Sarge," he rumbled, "you really better come look at this." "All right, Gluber, stay here. Everybody lay low. Keep quiet. Don't start any large fires." She cast around for the next most responsible person on the chain of command and sighed. "Oh, God. Oh, well. No help for it. Blanchett, the bear's in charge." He made the bear salute. "He says he's honoured by your trust, Sarge." And the Silker nodded. "Can't be any worse than some of the generals." "All right. Let's go." Hashtag Team Bear. Chapter 11. Sings to Trees had finally finished every small chore to be done around the farm, and by mid-afternoon too. This was so unusual that he sat down into the rocking chair on the porch with his eyes closed, because he was fairly sure that the moment he opened them, he would see something he'd forgotten, and, well, then he'd have to get up again. Fleabane ambled over and flopped down at his feet. Sings to Trees dangled a hand over the arm of the chair, and the coyote dragged a long tongue over his fingers. The elf was content to slouch in the chair for a few minutes, feeling the afternoon sun baking his face and forearms. Sometimes, even though he was fairly young, as elves go, the whole thing got away from him. Too many animals, too many injuries, too many things that needed to get done right this minute. He occasionally even wished for an assistant. Unfortunately, humans weren't all that interested in sending their young to live with an elf, and the other elves, he knew well enough what they thought. He was some kind of martyr, as far as they were concerned. They were glad he existed, but nobody wanted to get too close for fear of getting unicorn crap, or something worse on them. Sometimes he thought about giving it all up, moving into the glade and taking up something respectable, like glass whispering. In a few hundred years, when he was ancient and his knees creaked like old floorboards, did he really want to be tottering around the farm, midwifing unicorns and bandaging trolls? He opened his eyes with a sigh. And there was a troll looking at him. Sings to Trees didn't quite yelp, but he did make a choked noise. Fleabane's tail thumped companionably on the boards. The coyote liked trolls. They brought goat meat, and Fleabane was desperately fond of goat. The troll was sitting on the path and spilling over on the sides. He recognized it as Frog Snoggler. That wasn't the troll's real name, but it was the closest phonetic equivalent to the complex set of sounds that it used to describe itself. At least he thought it was describing itself. He'd never been able to learn their language. Fortunately, they understood his perfectly well. "You gave me quite a start," the elf said, getting up. The troll's silent approach didn't surprise him. They moved with eerie silence for their size, but seeing one out and about before sunset was unusual. "Grah," said the troll, and smiled. Trolls always smiled. Their mouths were wide and frog-like and naturally suited to it. With its eyes squeezed tight against the sunlight, Frog Snoggler looked almost comically pleased. "What are you doing up at this hour, anyway?" Sings to Trees asked, coming down from the porch. The troll's face fell. "Grah," it said humbly and held out its arms. "Oh, no." Cradled against its chest, almost lost against the clay-coloured bulk, lay a battered grey fox. An ugly leg trap, all steel fangs and metal, hung grotesquely from one small back leg. "Grah?" asked the troll anxiously, holding out the injured animal. "Grah." Sings to Trees got his arms under the fox, who snapped weakly at him. The trap hit his chest with a metallic clunk, and outrage choked him. "Bloody poachers," he growled, shifting his grip on the fox. The trap chattered again. "Grah," agreed the troll. Its low forehead wrinkled in a frown. Immense tusks glittered briefly at the edges of its mouth. Sings to Trees took a very long, very deep breath. and let the anger go. There were more important matters at hand. The fox was a skinny little thing, panting in pain, probably dehydrated as well, and standing around with his teeth gritted didn't do the poor creature any good. First things first. He wasn't strong enough to get the leg trap off himself, but fortunately brute strength was squatting an arm's length away. "Okay, Frogsnoggler, I'm going to need your help." "Grog," it nodded vigorously. "I'll hold him. I want you to pull the trap open, slowly, and I'll see if we can get the leg out without something worse happening." The fox's leg was badly cut, but not crushed. The little animal had been lucky. Sings to Trees tossed a towel over its head to keep it from ripping his arm open, held the fox's torso firmly under his elbow, and nodded to the troll. "Carefully now." Frogsnoggler reached down and opened the steel trap as casually as Sings to Trees might open a book. The elf pulled the fox's foot free, working as delicately as he could to keep the wound from being torn even wider by the cruel metal teeth. The fox panted in pain. It took less than a minute, but several subjective eternities passed for Sings to Trees. "Got it, got it. There." He reached out and patted Frogsnoggler's flank with his free hand. "Well done." The troll beamed at him. "Gra! Gra! Gra! Ha ha ha!" Sings to Trees had no idea what the troll had just said, but he could venture a guess. "I think he'll probably be fine, but I need to treat this. Can you help me a little more if the daylight's not bothering you too much?" "Gra! Gra!" The troll waved a hoof-like hand dismissively. I love that bit. That is my favourite bit in the book. The image of Frogsnoggler going, "Ah!" "Then, if you could take him." Sings to Trees placed the fox back into the troll's arms and went to get catgut and a needle. Cleaning the wound and sewing the fox's leg up was a tedious process for Sings to Trees, and an undoubtedly painful one for the fox, despite the sedative the elf poured down its throat. He was rather glad the troll was holding the animal. The fox kept snapping, kept trying to thrash, but it might as well have been held down by a mountain. One more, and there we go. He tied off the thread. "Okay, I'll keep him for a few days and make sure it heals up clean, and he gets a couple of square meals." He accepted the fox again. "Thank you. And oh no!" Gra. Sings to Trees leveled an accusing finger at Frogsnoggler. "Why didn't you tell me he was biting you?" Gra. The troll shrugged and scuffed the dirt with one hoof like a small child caught at mischief. Its left arm was full of tooth marks, most of which had skidded off the thick hide, but a few were filling up with blood. "Stay right there. I'm cleaning those." Gra. The fox went into an empty hutch, most recently home to an infant manticore. Sings to Trees put a bowl of water in with him and draped the towel in the corner. He went back out to the porch. Frogsnoggler had waited. Sings to Trees picked up the bottle of iodine, turned around, and sighed. The troll's eyes riveted on the bottle. Its mouth sagged in a parody of despair. "Oh, oh, come on, you're a big troll," said Sings to Trees. This was something of an understatement. Frogsnoggler was probably close to 2 tons and stood nearly 8 feet tall. "And I know you're brave. You stood there while that fox bit you, and never a peep." Grrr. The elf put his hands on his hips. Frogsnoggler cowered away, one arm over its eyes. Trembling, the troll held out its injured arm, tears welling in his dinner plate-sized eyes. Now this was the standard trollish response to all medical treatment, and Sings to Trees knew full well Frogsnoggler would have done the same thing for removing a splinter or splinting a bone, but he was still torn between wry amusement and, well, feeling a bit like an ogre. In truth, it was probably nothing. Trolls sustained worse every time they went after a billy goat, but still, foxes weren't known for their clean mouths. He brandished the iodine bottle and a clean rag. The troll sniffled through the whole operation. Finally, Sings to Trees set the rag aside. "All done!" Frogsnoggler inched its hand down from its eyes and gazed at him worriedly. "Really? All done?" said the elf and patted the troll's shoulder. "And you were very brave. I'm very proud of you." A smile cracked the immense face. Frogsnoggler leapt up and cut an elephantine caper around Sings to Trees. "Gra! Gra! Gra! Gra!" Now, if that gets infected, if it turns red or it starts to smell bad, I want you to come back here, okay? Grah! Then go on home before the sun fries you. The troll nodded, reached out a hand, and patted Singster rather heavily on the shoulder. Oh, the elf patted the troll's knuckles in return, which had wiry black hair growing from them. I'll probably release the fox in 2 or 3 days, if you want to come back and see him. Grah! Frog Snoggler said happily, and turned and scampered, insomuch as something the size of a team of oxen can scamper, into the woods. Singster chuckled to himself. He loved trolls. They were so immensely good-hearted. He didn't know how they managed to be voracious predators. Every time they saw a wounded animal, they brought it to him instead of eating it. This wasn't the first patient that had come to him in the arms of a troll. Once it had been a half-grown moose. The moose had been a fairly straightforward job, barbed wire wrapped around one leg, but treating the adult troll, who had been kicked half senseless, had taken most of the night. He went back in and checked on the fox. It was resting now, still breathing more shallowly than he'd like, but sleeping nonetheless. There were herbs he needed, but his supply was running low. He really needed to go out to the bog meadow and pick some before the season turned completely and everything dried out. And there, of course, went the rest of the afternoon. He laughed a bit to himself as he picked up a basket. He should have known, of course. There was never any free time that wasn't immediately filled with a crisis. But he felt good anyway. Between the sleeping fox and the capering troll, his earlier glum mood had broken up. Maybe he would be doing this when he was old. Someone had to. And if he needed a seeing-eye troll to help him around the farm, he suspected he only had to ask. Stepping out onto the porch again, he glanced around for the trap. It wouldn't do to step on it, but he hadn't seen where Frog Snoggler had dropped it. He got down the front steps and saw it. The troll, casually and without fanfare, had reduced the trap to fragments of twisted metal. Singster could not have duplicated the destruction without a hammer and possibly a forge. The elf made a faint, thoughtful sound to himself and went off to gather herbs. I love that the general consensus in the chat is that yes, Frog Snoggler is the best.
You're right.
I'm warm, but it's all good. Oh my, oh sir. Chapter 12. The farm.
Hydrate.
Oh, thank you, Kiwi Jelly. The farmhouse was very quiet. It was too quiet. Now, generally, when people say it's too quiet, it's a prelude to a monster with a lot of teeth jumping out of the grass. In this case, however, since the only thing that could qualify as monsters with a lot of teeth were the goblins themselves, it was just plain too quiet. The farmhouse was a small sod building, and that was odd too, since there was a whole forest right there, and who builds out of sod when you have wood? And the fences were the low, dry stone affairs that looked cute and quirky and charming, till you realised they're made of all the rocks that some poor farmer had to haul out of a field by hand. There was wood, but not too much. The timbers were in place only when nothing else would do. A few scattered tree stumps across the farm showed where they'd probably come from. It was a neatly kept yard with a thatch roof and a small hen house and a pig pen. Around back, a low stable held 3 empty stalls. It was really quiet. Perhaps they went into town. Horses aren't here. And took the pigs and chickens with them, asked Murray skeptically. A rising, rattling hum startled them all until they realised that one of the trees dotting the property had cicadas in it. The insects buzzed their way up the register and then fell silent. And it was still too quiet. Maybe it was market day. They took the pigs and chickens to sell. Every single one such. You got a better explanation? Algod cleared his throat. It must have looked pretty odd, carrying all those chickens and walking. The wagon's still here. They looked at the wagon. It was distinctly wagon-like. The cicadas buzzed again. Checked the hen house. They made their way around the farmhouse. Coming out of the woods, they had been moving like goblins on a raid, low to the ground, skulking, hiding behind things. It was beginning to seem silly in this deep abandoned silence, but Nasilka hadn't lived this long by going into enemy territory and then sauntering around in the open. Besides, it was so quiet that it was almost comforting to crouch behind water barrels and old haystacks. Made you feel like you could hide from that terrible silence. The last stretch to the hen house had no cover for anyone over 6 inches tall. Crouched behind the compost bin, the 3 goblins eyed the distance. Nasilka gritted her teeth, squared her shoulders, and said, "Wait here." She didn't run. Goblins know all about monsters. They are related, after all, and they know all about the rules. Like small children, they know the rules in their bones. If there was something out there, something cloaking itself in the silence, if she ran, then that meant it could run too. So she walked to the door of the hen house over earth packed hard and littered with old chicken droppings and bits of straw, while the skin between her shoulders on the back of her neck crept, crawled, cringed. Algol and Murray crouched together, shoulder to shoulder, biting their lips. The sergeant reached out, caught the wired door, and flung it open. Sunlight lanced through cracks in the ceiling and made pale spots on the straw. Old dust, old straw, old feathers. There were reasonably fresh droppings near the door, but no clucking greeted her, and there was no movement of nervous chickens along the walls. She considered looking behind the door. She decided not to tempt fate. She closed the door instead and walked back across the courtyard with a deliberately steady tread. "Empty," she said in a low voice. "Few days, probably." Algol, without saying anything, crab walked over to the pig pen and looked over the fence. The other 2 followed him. "There's still a half bucket of slops here, Sarge," he said quietly. "Well, it's not that weird. Have you ever known pigs to leave any slops behind them?" They stood around the slop bucket like 3 witches around a cauldron. It was indeed half full. The sides of the bucket had crusted and dried, and there was mould growing in the bottom. Algol dipped a finger in, pulled it out, covered in gunk, and popped it in his mouth, rolled the taste around like a gaunt. "More than 3 days? Less than a week. Needs salt." They stood in silence then. I love that. Then as one looked at the farmhouse, Nasilka sighed. "All right, what are you guys thinking?" "Plague, maybe," said Algol. Murray shook his head. "No bodies. Where'd the chickens go?" "Maybe they buried the bodies and took the chickens?" "Don't explain the pig slop. I haven't seen anything that could be a grave marker." "Maybe they left suddenly. Bandits. No blood. They wouldn't have taken the chickens." "Still doesn't explain the pig slop." "Maybe bandits killed the pigs before they were done eating. No blood in the pen. The place is in pretty good shape. Bandits would have wrecked the joint." "Could they be hiding?" Algol jerked his chin at the farmhouse. "With the pigs, and the chickens, and the mules, or whatever else ought to be in these empty stalls. It's not that big an house." They all looked at the house in question again. Nasilka nodded. "All right, let's go in. Don't bother sneaking. Let's just get this over with." Now, in a properly run universe, the door would have opened with one of those long creaks that would have gone on forever. But it was hung on leather strap hinges, so it swung open really quietly. The interior was dark and quiet. 2 chairs, 1 table, 1 bed. A thin film of dust lay over everything. The goblins looked towards the bed, which was unmade, but empty, and breathed a sigh of relief. A plate of food lay on the table with a fork next to it. There was a piece of elderly broccoli speared on the end of the fork. Mould fuzzed most of the other contents on the plate. Algol stepped onto something that groaned, and they all jumped. He leapt back, revealing a square wooden trapdoor set in the floor. "Root cellar, probably," said Nasilka. Her dad had been a mountain goblin, and she had no fear of tunnels and holes, but she found she really, really didn't want to go down there. Algol and Murray, well, they looked ready to bolt. She reminded herself that it was just as alarming for them, and they were from hill and marsh and didn't even have the advantage of having tunnels in their blood, and "You 2 stay up here until I call." The corporals visibly relaxed. She grabbed the handle on the trapdoor, counted to 3, and yanked it up. Dust rattled down from the opening, but that was all. A ladder led down into the earth. Nasilka pulled her stub of candle from her kit and lit it. Right, here goes nothing. She didn't know what she was expecting. No, that was a lie. She was expecting to find a couple of dead bodies, possibly something gnawing on them. Please, God, let me be wrong. Please let it be empty. The gods were kind. The root cellar was barely large enough to turn around in, full of shelves that groaned under the weight of canned preserves. The floor was dirt, the walls dirt, and somebody had tossed an old burlap sack on the ground to soak up spills, and that was all. There were no bodies, unless somebody had canned them. I really wish I hadn't thought that. Well, at least we won't starve. Murray! Murray's head appeared in the hole. Yes, Sarge. Have Algol stand guard, not we lug these up. See, there's a blanket we can carry this stuff in. There was a set of rough blankets on the bed, which were a welcome find all on their own. Murray rigged 2 slings with harness leather scavenged from the stable, and they filled them with jars of indeterminate preserves. Most seemed to be peaches, with some dark red things that might have been meat. Tomatoes, plums, oddly coloured peaches thrown in for good measure. Thus loaded, Murray and Nasilka did a quick sweep of the farmhouse. A frying pan and an iron pot were too good to pass up. Nasilka did not want to be making tea in Blanchett's helmet on a regular basis, along with a small sack of salt and a bigger sack of flour. They emerged from the house, heavily laden and clanking as they walked. Despite the mysterious emptiness of the farm, discovering the food couldn't help but raise their spirits. This lasted for a good 5 seconds. Nasilka said, "Where's Algol?" The 2 goblins looked around. He was right out here. "Algol!" hissed Nasilka. She didn't want to yell. She couldn't shake the feeling that yelling would bring something down on them. "Algol, where are you?" The cicadas were the only answer. "He can't have gone far. He can't have gone far," muttered Nasilka. "Unless whatever got the farmers got him too," Murray replied glumly.
Thank you, Murray.
"This is it. Game over, man. Game over." "Put a lid on it, Corporal." Murray gave her the look that said, "You know I'm right, but it's okay. I understand you have to say that." She hated that look. She just couldn't do anything about it because, well, he usually was right, hang it all. We can't just leave without him," she said slowly, scanning the fields. "But I don't want to stay out here in plain sight either." Far across the field, she could just make out the town. It wasn't close enough to see any people. They probably couldn't have seen the goblins either, but still, better safe than sorry. Murray dug out his looky tube thing. Nasilka opened her mouth to say that she'd check behind the farmhouse and then stopped. Splitting up did not seem like a good idea. She fiddled with the strap on her sling. "Sarge, did you find him?" "No, but, Sarge, there's no smoke over the town." "That's pretty warm out. Why would there be smoke? Town that size is going to have a blacksmith. Plus there's a windmill over there, which means there's a miller. Where there's millers, there's usually a baker, except there isn't. And even when it's warm, people have to cook, but none of the chimneys are going at all. There's no smoke in the sky anywhere. I don't see any horses or cows in the fields." He raised the tube again and stopped. Nasilka pushed the tube gently back down. "Corporal," she said quietly, "let's not borrow trouble, all right? Let's just find alcohol and get out of here." He wasn't behind the farmhouse. He wasn't in the chicken coop. Nasilka's nerves were fraying badly and there was a cold stone in her gut. Murray kept yanking on his ponytail as if hoping to find alcohol hiding somewhere inside it. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose—" "Sarge!" Murray pointed. She whirled. Across the fields, coming out of a drainage ditch, was a familiar, tall, grey-green figure. Nasilka exhaled. It seemed to come from her toes. She stomped towards him, furious and relieved all at once. "Corporal, what in the name of the great grim gods do you think of—" "Look, Sarge!" he cried, holding something over his head. It was small. It was muddy. It wiggled. It was a kitten. Algol was covered in mud and grinning from ear to ear. "Oh, for God's sake," said Nasilka, covering her eyes. "I heard him mewing." He was stuck down in a pipe in the ditch and I got him out. Can I keep him, Sarge? Can I? Please? Corporal, she began and stopped because she didn't know what she was going to say after that. She should never have let him name the supply goat. Once you start naming goats, it's all downhill from there. She massaged the bridge of her nose and tried again. Corporal, we are goblins, the scourge of the night, stealers of children, marauders of the dark, the terror of, well, fairly terrible. Anyway, Algol looked at her blankly, petting the kitten. We aren't kitten people. Algol stared at her, still petting the kitten. It made little merp noises and butted its head against his big fingers. But Sarge, he was stuck. We're behind enemy lines. We don't know how we're going to get back. And you want to adopt a kitten? Algol sniffed. The sergeant could see a traitorous moisture beginning under his eyes. We can't leave him, he said quietly. He's the only thing alive out here. He'll die. Corporal. His lower lip wibbled. Oh! Fine, she said, relenting. If somebody eats it, don't come crying to me. Thank you, Sarge. Algol thrust the kitten at her face, and the Silka recoiled. Look, Kitty, this is Sarge. She says I can keep you. Say hi. The stealer of children and marauder of the dark grudgingly reached up and petted the kitten. It licked her fingers with a raspy little tongue. She grumbled. It purred. By rights, I should have you thrown in the stockade, abandoning your post like that. She muttered. We don't really have a stockade, Sarge. Murray pointed out. I ought to make him build one then. Algol, besotted with his new kitten, ignored this. Nazilka threw her hands in the air. Don't do it again, Corporal, or I'll bust you back down to private so fast. I think I'll name him Wiggles. He looks like a Wiggles. Nazilka knew when she was beaten. Wiggles perched on Algol's shoulder and purred the entire way back to camp. The teddy bear, by way of Blanchett, had nothing to report. The twins were asleep in a pile, looking like lumpy green kittens themselves. Luba was exploring the inner reaches of his left ear. All appeared right with the world. The returning goblins slung the preserves off their shoulders and set about making tea in the pot. This time, hold on. The returning goblins slung the preserves off their shoulders and set about making tea in the pot this time. Blanchett was pleased to get his helmet back. Zilka had just taken the first sip, sweet, gritty, fairly revolting, exactly what she'd been looking for when Weasel burst out of the bushes. Sarge! Oh, crud. The little goblin was scarlet-faced, and her hair had come out of its tight tail. Sweat glued it across her cheeks. Her chest heaved. It's... Calm down, kiddo. Silka knew it was the height of rudeness to finish sentences for somebody with a stutter, but this sounded like an emergency. Something's happened to Thumper. Sit down, take a deep breath. Okay, now tell me what it is. He's hurt. It's elves. She nodded and shook her head, then threw her hands in the air. Nasilka interpreted this correctly as a sign of a tale too complex to be summed up in yes or no questions. Alright guys, let's move. Tell me where you last saw him, kiddo, and tell me on the way. And that's chapter 12.
And we've started a poll in the chat. Who is tonight's MVP?
It's clearly the kitten.
So our options are not displaying. There we go. Frog Snobbler the troll, Blanchett the bear, Wiggles the kitten, or poor Nasilka whose K went missing.
I think Nasilka probably wins hands down.
It's quite likely. Shall we take a little bit of a break and be right back?
Yeah, we're going to step out and
let the poll finish, and we'll be right back.